Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Casey Riley, the chair of Global Contemporary Art here at MIA, and happily also the curator of photography and new media. So I'm wearing that hat this afternoon to introduce someone I adore and respect in equal measure, my dear friend Sarah Meister. And I'd like to say that I cannot think of a better title or occasion for her visit because Sarah herself is the very embodiment of generosity. She has done so many things for so many of us in the field over the many years and really decades of her career. That I wouldn't even begin to be able to list them here, up to and including being one of the first mentors for my treasured colleague, Leslie Raina. So the connections are vast and deep. But before I introduce Sarah and talk about her many accomplishments, I also want to acknowledge and thank Bada Turgut and her amazing colleague and also dear friend, Leslie Hammonds of Weinstein Hammonds Gallery. These two women are behind the incredible gift that came to Mia recently from Richard Sweet and Faye Gallus. For those of you who have not yet been to the Perlman Gallery on the third floor, I hope that you'll skip right up there after this lecture and take a gander at all of the splendor in that space. Yeah, without further ado, I'd like to talk about my buddy. So, as you undoubtedly know, Sarah is the executive director of Aperture, a nonprofit publisher founded in 1952 by a group of artists. Sarah joined Aperture following more than 25 years in the Department of Photographs at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, where she curated numerous acclaimed exhibitions, including Photoclubismo, Brazilian Modernist Photography in 2021, Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures in 2020, and Making Space, Women Artists and Post-War Abstraction. She was a co-curator of that in 2017. Her publications have considered many areas of the field, including works by Gordon Parks in 2020, Francis Benjamin Johnston in 2019, and the 1967 MoMA exhibition New Documents in 2017, Josef Albers in 2016, Horacio Coppola and Greta Stern, and she was a co-author of that publication in 2015, Bill Brandt in 2013, and many more. Sarah does not sleep. You are right. She is always busy. And she is probably writing an essay right now, right before she jumps on stage. She was the inaugural instructor for the online course Seeing Through Photographs, with which many of you are probably familiar, and maybe how you first learned about Sarah and her incredible scholarship in the field. And she is also the co-director of the August Sonder Project, a 5-year research initiative at MoMA and hosted by Columbia University. Sarah is the curator most currently of Carrie Mae Weems' The Heart of the Matter, which will open at the Galleria d'Italia in Turin in April of this year, accompanied by a fully illustrated catalog. And I can tell you that she was working on that last night while we were having dinner. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sarah Meister.
That was very generous, Casey. And I do sleep, and I was not working on that project at dinner, for the record. But it is a thrill to be here. It means a lot to be able to visit Minneapolis, to see these glorious galleries, to spend so much time with Casey and getting to know other people who are so important in the photography world here. And yes, to connect with my old colleague, Leslie, who worked with me at MoMA way back when. It's clear also that I probably need to come back in a couple weeks to see the Ernest Cole exhibition, and I'll speak about that in a little bit. So, my perspective on the history of photography has been shaped by those photographs that I've been privileged to encounter and my commitment to connect them with photo curious audiences, which is to say, practically everyone. I feel fortunate to have done this for 2.5 decades at MoMA and for the last 3.5 years at Aperture. So in 1952, Aperture's founders, who were, as Casey mentioned, a visionary group of artists and scholars and curators, they identified what they called a vital need that their quarterly magazine would address. And it was this: to communicate with serious photographers and creative people everywhere, whether professional, amateur, or student, and to nurture a community around their shared passion. For all that has changed in the last 73 years, this remains at the heart of Aperture's unique role in the field today. And I'd argue that it is also at the heart of the exhibition that provides the reason for my visit to Minneapolis. I'm intrigued by the plurality of the medium and its democratic spirit. Photography as advertisement, as you see here, and photography as art. Photography matters today more than ever, and I really feel strongly that no medium can match its ability to register our individuality, but also to represent the various stories that we refer to cumulatively as history. So, my thinking about photography and its centrality in our contemporary life and our work at Aperture is anchored by the following question: how can we honor the sophistication and complexity of serious photography while fostering an accessible and engaging dialogue with creative people everywhere? Or perhaps, how can those of us who think and care deeply about this generous, unruly medium be similarly generous with people who are simply photo curious? This is an installation view of an exhibition that occurred early in my time at MoMA, organized by Peter Galassi, who had hired me, that traced the dynamic interplay between, on the one hand, so called vernacular photography. And by that, Peter meant more or less utilitarian photographs or ones that fulfilled some personal, commercial, or documentary purpose. And on the other hand, photographs intended by their makers to be fine art. MoMA's collection, as well as the prints in a generous outlook, are exemplary in their attentiveness to both the fine art and so called vernacular practices. Although perhaps in this black and white installation view, it's difficult to distinguish between them. But the central image with the dark matte actually has a lot of color in it. It's this. It's a platinum and gum bichromate print by Edward Steichen, who would later become one of the directors of the Department of Photography at MoMA. In art museums, it makes sense to be talking about serious photography. Exquisite, rare, unique examples abound in MoMA's collection, and this painstakingly produced and mysteriously rendered pictorialist treasure is among them. These works by Vera Lutter and Hiroshi Sugimoto are other compelling examples of serious photography. The Lutter is technically a variant of what's on view because I didn't have a high enough version of that, so apologies. But it's equally true that there are many exquisite, rare, and unique photographs, such as this one, which was also in Peter Galassi's American Photography exhibition, that were not intended for museums. These were commercial images made for hire by professional photographers, but they are, I would argue, in, exactly as beautiful and compelling as the Steichen. And here are just two of the many memorable works on view in a generous outlook that fall into this expansive category. One of the things that I've always admired about Alex Soth, who isn't feeling well today, so he's not with us, but I was hoping to get him to come up on stage and speak about this, um, is that I admire his consistent willingness to deal and engage with the messy entirety of photography, both in his own practice and in his approach to others. And I think you're really missing half the fun, or actually 90% of the fun, if you're only focusing on those works that were intended to be fine art. So, reaching back to the earliest days of the medium, there are countless examples, wonderful ones, of photography as art, and it makes sense to collect and display these in the context of an art museum. So, a work like this by Talbot connects very intentionally with traditions of allegory and still life in other medium. And the histories of photography that I received at MoMA, which in turn influenced many histories told around the world, not just mine, were shaped by a few brilliant minds, John Tchaikovsky and Peter Galassi among them. They sought to sort of make sense of the raucous plurality of the medium by clarifying this distinction between fine art, art with a capital A, and so called vernacular practices, which included, well, everything else from Irving Penn to these humble Kodak snapshots. Of course, there is an ocean of difference between these, and I am only just beginning to come to terms with the adverse consequences of lumping vernacular practices under a single umbrella. When you consider photographs as unrelated in form or intent as a modest family snapshot, like those Kodak ones, and ambitious, technically complex advertisements in the same category, such as the Irving Penn, you risk flattening or leaving out entirely significant chunks of photography's history. This is what I discovered when working on what would become my last exhibition at MoMA called Photoclubismo, which focused on the practices of a group of amateur photographers, such as Julio Agostinelli, seen here, active in Sao Paulo in the mid 20th century. So I'm going to linger a moment on this project as a means of reflecting on a common blind spot of mine, and I hope now no longer of any of ours, which is this dismissal of amateur practices. And I'll propose an approach to addressing it. So in 2005, MoMA acquired these two photographs by Geraldo de Barros, and at the time, honestly, I didn't know what to make of them. On the right, there was a cameraless image made with perforated proto-computer cards that de Barros had pilfered from his day job at the local bank. On the left was a self-portrait made in 1949. I included that portrait in a 2011 collection installation alongside, and it's seen here on the far left, and but I put them big because it's impossible to see in the installation view, alongside an exactly contemporaneous work by Robert Rauschenberg. Both de Barros and Rauschenberg were painters at the time, amateur in the case of de Barros, intrigued by photography, making portraits around 1949 through light and shadow. Simply having these works in MoMA's collection, sprinkled with a little humility about my incomplete understanding of the circumstances or motivation of their creation, is as compelling an argument as I can imagine for institutional collecting. So here, in the far distance on the green wall, is a installation view of both of these works by de Barros, with a painting, also by de Barros, from the Cisneros collection between them. This was my last exhibition at MoMA, Photoclubismo. In the 16 years between the acquisition of those two works in 2005 and the opening of this exhibition in 2021, I learned a great deal, allowing me to create new contexts for understanding work that had been simply historical anomalies. The Photoclubismo exhibition was made possible thanks to generous travel and research support, with one important supplement, an an acquisitions budget that made it possible for this work by Gertrudis Altschul and the next 6 images I'll share, and more than 40 works by other members of the Photocine Club Banderange to create a visual and intellectual context for those two de Barros photographs. Once the museum owned these Brazilian amateur works began appearing in collection installations that were not specifically focused on Brazil. So, for example, as Casey mentioned, 10 of the photographs by Gertrudis Altschul were in an exhibition I organized with my friend and colleague, Star Figura, Making Space, Women Artists and Post-War Abstraction in 2017. And I'll share a few others just to suggest the vitality and breadth of what we were collecting. With each acquisition, we were able to tell more complex, more international stories in our galleries, on the pages of our publications, and on our website. We were able to achieve an important gender balance thanks to extra time for research and additional funds for a second group of acquisitions. And you'll see on here on the screen names that are likely as unfamiliar to you as they were to me before I visited Brazil for the first time in 2012 and embarked upon the research that would become Photoclubismo nearly a decade later. The unfamiliarity with these names might lead you to ask yourself, as I did, how is it possible that amazing works such as these, which I soon learned in the 1950s had been winning prizes in salons on 6 continents around the globe, how could they be so unknown a half century later? And to answer this question, I knew I had to do more research and to be willing to examine the very structure of the photo histories I had received, including Tchaikovsky's and Galassi's framing of the distinction between fine art and vernacular practices. Because amateur practices, such as those featured here on the cover of the monthly magazine of the Photocine Club Banderange, would have been grouped under the term vernacular, because, although I'd argue not in these 4 instances, amateurs were often lauded for achievements that smacked of imitation. The salons in which they participated awarded points according to a stiflingly strict set of criteria, so that in many cases, although again, in my opinion, not here, technical proficiency was arguably the highest virtue, eclipsing those more difficult to quantify values of vision or originality or ambition, which, in my opinion, are essential elements of art that carries with it the capacity to inspire. So here are 4 other issues of that same monthly magazine, these are examples of work by Sao Paulo amateurs that I would characterize as hopelessly cliched. Cute children, beautiful women, misty landscapes, and of course, cats. I struggled with the fact that the very same amateur photo club that nurtured the talent of so many inspiring achievements, like these and the other pictures I just showed you, not only tolerated, but celebrated work such as this. I came to appreciate in time that one of these truths did not negate the other. The Photocine Club Banderange and the creative environment of Sao Paulo in the late 40s and 50s successfully encouraged the careers of a number of talented photographers in the company of a number of others decidedly less original, and I offer this while acknowledging the limitations of my perspective, temporally, geographically, and certainly linguistically. Despite the fact that these works had been heralded internationally in the decades following the Second World War, by the time I was maturing as a curator, they had been effectively forgotten outside of Brazil due to a double bias against amateurs and the even more damaging notion of the so-called periphery, which suggested that truly original art only emerged in the Northern Hemisphere metropolises such as New York or Paris or Berlin. This work, and 6 others by Thomas Farkas, who was another member of the Photocine Club Banderange, had been acquired by Edward Steichen for the Museum of Modern Art in 1949 and put into the museum's study collection, where they languished for decades until we began to piece together this puzzle. But Steichen was paying attention to them in the beginning. In the early 1950s, he included Farkas's work, so this was just a little more than a year after that acquisition. You see it here, I don't know if I can point, but it's in the center of that wall. So you see it alongside the work of many other practitioners whose names remain widely known in the US. Aaron Siskind, Harry Callahan, even early Diane Arbus and Robert Rauschenberg. Surely to be included in a landmark exhibition at an esteemed museum in New York with work from that museum's collection suggests a fairly secure place in the history of photography, no? And yet I would argue that subsequent generations of photo historians, myself among them, in an earnest desire to make sense of this unruly medium, declared hierarchies, such as the distinction between vernacular and fine art, and inadvertently neglected achievements that occupied realms beneath those of art. Now, this, officially, is the catalog for an exhibition organized by the director of the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. And it is by far my favorite illustration of the porosity of the photo world in the 1950s. This was the moment of Aperture's founding, and I'll remind you that their goal was to communicate with serious photographers and creative people everywhere. So this, the catalog for Steichen's highly ambitious exhibition of abstraction that featured Thomas Farkas and all of those others that I mentioned. The catalog was an amateur photo magazine that otherwise, so far as I can tell, appears to have been exclusively focused on creating opportunities to consider the female nude under the pretense of art. So if you were a gentleman living, let's say, in St. Paul, not Minneapolis, and you wanted to look at photographs of beautiful nude women, you could subscribe to Photo Arts, and every month you would be delivered a new selection of these, only though to make sure that you were improving your capacity as a photographer, right? Whatever the distinctions were between high and low, between fine art and vernacular, between serious photography and creative people everywhere that later emerged, in 1951, these were surprisingly intertwined. One more brief illustration of the photo world at that moment. So immediately following abstraction in photography, Steichen organized an exhibition introducing, so it said, the work of 5 French photographers to audiences in New York, including Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose work you see here. Steichen didn't mention it except in a footnote of Cartier-Bresson's bio, but I would like to remind everyone that Nancy Newhall had organized a major one-person exhibition of Cartier-Bresson's work in 1947, less than 5 years earlier, at the same museum. Let's move on. The press release underscores the extent to which the very terms used to describe photography, indeed the characteristics that defined its value in a museum of modern art, were still very much in flux. So here is a quote from Steichen's press release for 5 French photographers. He writes, "This is photography with a tender simplicity, a sly humor, a warm earthiness, the everydayness of the familiar, and the convincing aliveness found only in the best of the folk arts. Here is the offering of a new sphere of influence and inspiration to amateur photographers. It supplies a threshold leading to a new folk art that waits to be given life by the millions now practicing photography. MoMA, advocating for photography as folk art, Henri Cartier-Bresson as a folk artist. There are many who had been instrumental in establishing a department of photography at MoMA who would have vehemently disagreed, including Beaumont Newhall, who was no longer at MoMA, but who would, the following year, help dream Aperture into existence. My point here is to emphasize that the very terms of this conversation have been in a near constant state of evolution since the invention of the medium, and this continues today. I think it might be useful to consider how institutions such as MoMA have built and worked with their collections over time, and specifically how photography, both vernacular, for all the issues I have with that term, and those works conceived by their makers to be fine art have been represented more recently in their collection galleries. And I think in many ways, A Generous Outlook is its own microcosm of these same conversations. So in 2016, the curatorial staff at MoMA began a process of reimagining how we would display our collections, which culminated in late 2019 with the reopening of a more integrated, significantly expanded collection gallery suite. It was a thrilling process, and our strategies for displaying the treasures we were entrusted to care for were transformed by that process. I'll focus the remainder of my time on 3 collection displays and 1 exhibition, which was also drawn from the collection, that built upon this creative tension between serious photography and creative people everywhere. So this gallery examined photography in its many modes of circulation, which is one of the driving forces behind the democracy of the medium. So on the left, you see 3 prints, there were more, installed above the books upon which their makers' reputations had been established. So while MoMA did collect the prints, we also collected the books in the library. And I would argue that over the course of the 100 years between them, they were created and they ended up there, many, many, many more people saw the books than the prints. On the far wall, you see some framed photographs installed among reproductions of the magazines in which they circulated. This solution was a practical one, which allowed for the rotation of light-sensitive prints, while leaving the central argument of the gallery intact. But arguably more importantly, it highlighted that for all the aura and beauty of the individual prints, many of these works were primarily known through the more democratic forms of books and magazines. And while it's a little difficult to grasp in this view, I do want to mention the vitrine that enclosed a telephone and a radio from the architecture and design collections, along with this wonderful album. The very presence of a personal album of snapshots, once belonging to a bell girl, or as Blanche Parker described herself here, a weaver of speech, points to an opportunity that we as curators wanted to encourage, considering the more diverse histories that were less focused on an established canon. And what better way to do this than through photography? Equally, in attending to the diversity of the medium itself, it allowed us to include makers who used their medium to craft very personal narratives. The photograph on the left was one of my favorite acquisitions that I worked on at MoMA, made in conjunction with research for Leah Dickerman's Jacob Lawrence exhibition. McNeil's daughter and I worked together to establish a price for this and about 24 other prints, somewhere that struck us both as fair, between priceless, which they were to us both, and worthless, as the market might have led one to believe. And we both understood that in reaching this compromise, these images could or would become catalysts for so many different conversations. McNeil also, interestingly, was a member of his local amateur photo club in Washington, D.C., but he was also a professional photojournalist, which is a welcome reminder of the multitude of approaches to the medium, even for an individual. Another collection display for which I was responsible was anchored by the acquisition of a group of modern prints from Gordon Parks's 1957 photo essay for Life magazine called The Atmosphere of Crime. It was an opportunity to examine the ways in which photography was complicit in establishing an image of criminality in the public imagination, and the ways in which Parks used his camera to challenge those narratives. The vitrine here contained the story as it appeared in Life magazine, reminding visitors of its original mode of circulation, and a reminder, at least to me, not to be too precious, to embrace these full expressions of photography's past. The origin point of the acquisition, and ultimately of this display, is the print seen here on the lower right, which the museum acquired directly from Parks in 1993. Although the work was originally shot in color, and you see it up there on the top left, printed in color in Life magazine, um, grossly cropped, but we'll get to that another time. Parks initially didn't have sufficient funds to print it that way. MoMA's first acquisition was probably the earliest print, and it was a gelatin silver one. It's stunning and a reason to visit the museum, but it's also a reminder that if we limit ourselves to collecting and displaying exclusively vintage work, we're narrowing the history of photography to the people who had the resources or the luxury to leave us a record of what they had done in the form in which they had wanted to do it. I credit the Parks acquisition in 2019 and a nearly concurrent one of Ernest Cole in helping me shed some of my most entrenched snobberies, a process that has only accelerated since I've been at Aperture. That said, I believe unconditionally in museums as custodians of those most precious records of our past. So it was gratifying to see my MoMA colleagues feature this acquisition so thoughtfully after my departure. Without institutional dedication to preserving, sharing, contextualizing, and recontextualizing these objects, we would lose so much. But we need to honor and support this while grappling with the gaps and challenging why they exist. At this point in my career, I'm loving doing this at Aperture, where the fundamental democracy of the medium is both inevitable and central. If photography itself is a medium of multiples, the uniqueness of Vera Lucer or Steichen's prints being the exception, not the rule, then its very nature and its fullest potential reach is tied to magazines and books. The two recent books featured here, meaning in the middle and on the right, could have been published by MoMA if I had stayed, but I'm thrilled, and it seems fitting that they became Aperture titles, and that Aperture has organized the exhibition with Leslie Wilson of Cole's work that will open here next week, or the week after, maybe. Anyway, soon. One of my last exhibitions at MoMA, and perhaps the one of which I'm proudest, or at least the one that actually led me to Aperture, considered the work of Dorothea Lange, who was one of Aperture's founders. Lange was adamant that she was a photographer, not an artist. And I think she argued this because she believed that photographs were at their best when they were doing work in the service of something beyond and bigger than art. But I love that Sam Contis, who would certainly consider herself an artist before calling herself a photographer, her project Day Sleeper, which is seen here on the gray wall, freestanding wall on the left, the dark gray wall on the left, Sam Contis made a compelling case that Dorothea Lange was both. And I think it's really interesting to imagine how uncomfortable Lange was in what she considered to be the rarefied air of fine art. She really wanted her photographs to make a difference. And it's thanks to reading her words so closely that I'm sure in my interview for Aperture, I was the only person who could recite chapter and verse all of those early issues of Aperture magazine, Lange's oral history, you name it. Edward Steichen came to understand this need for photographs to make a difference in part, I would argue, through his relationship with Lang. When he curated the legendary exhibition, The Family of Man, in 1955, that eventually traveled around the world in 5 different versions. Casey and I have been to visit it on view in Luxembourg, where it's on permanent display. Um, I think that part of people's challenge in grappling with Steichen and the Family of Man is in its broad embrace of the medium and its commitment to connecting vast audiences through it. It is the antithesis, in many ways, of the elite few for whom Moonrise Mamaroneck was meant to communicate a half century earlier. So I was delighted when Casey mentioned that a little teeny book about this one photograph that I did at MoMA um, is sold in the bookstore here. And it is an interesting example. It's almost the opposite of the point um, that a print from this negative sold at Sotheby's for more than $600,000 in 2023. Was it worth it? Hard to say. There's something curious to me about fetishizing a single print of an image that arguably circulates in more forms than any other photograph ever made. Roy Stryker at the Farm Security Administration in 1936 made sure of that. It helps me reflect on the role of museums. The contexts created through public collections have the power to re-examine these histories and, in the process, we hope, change lives. So I'll conclude where I started, which is also the point of departure for Aperture's current strategic plan. When we do this, when we honor the complexity and the nuance of serious photography while creating an accessible and engaging dialogue among creative people everywhere, we're taking advantage of this vital plurality, indeed the generosity of this extraordinary medium. And I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. Thank you. Should we go back to the first image? Just have a picture of you. What a picture. We can talk about that.
Thank you, Sarah. That was so wonderful. And, as I was listening to all of the, wonderful thoughts that you've had over the years about this field, we both feel so passionately about, I was also thinking about you and what it meant for, 25 or 35 years of evolving as a mind in the field and how much growth that represents. So I just want to hold space for that. But I guess I'd like to look forward a little bit and think about your life now, and think about the connections that you've drawn so persuasively here in terms of the origins of this medium, the complexity of those origins, its commercial and so-called amateur uses, and the work that you do presently as a publisher. I will say as an aside, we went to the walkthrough yesterday and Sarah pulled out her badge and said, "I'm press." And I almost lost it because it was just so unexpected, but it's true. Now,
It's much more powerful than being a curator.
it's so true.
When you're pressed, people are like, "Oh, come."
But now, of course, with the photo book, with the Aperture photo book series that you're doing, the club. Yes. Thank you. You're really thinking very overtly about drawing the connections between your primary work now as the executive director of Aperture and also the photographers who are speaking to us through publications. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the lessons that you've drawn from your curatorial past, from thinking deeply about parks and Lang, but also all of the amazing people who are included in Photo Clubismo, and how that informs your selections now for those conversations, which happen monthly.
So thank you. The photo book club, the origins for that idea really started in seeing through photographs in the community of what they're called learners on Coursera, and it's a MOOC, which I didn't even know what it was when I started working on it. It stands for a massive open online course, and they're free. And the by the time I left MoMA, I think there were 375,000 people enrolled in that course. I mean, which really changed my thinking about a lot of things, because it's that's a lot of people, and those people speak a lot of languages and really were photo curious in the truest sense of the word. um, and it was in thinking through. Oh, so the MoMA, no, Coursera did a survey of the people who signed up for Seeing Through Photographs to see what they liked about it. And in the first 2 months of, after 2 months of that course being live, it turned out that 30% of the people who signed up had never heard of MoMA, never heard of it, but they signed up because they were interested in photography. I was like, wow, isn't that interesting? Because it points to the idea that the conversation we're having just isn't one that could possibly be bound by art museums. It's like, and so art museums are kind of almost uncomfortable places for those to be. And I wouldn't say that, I loved my job at MoMA. In fact, if Chris Boot hadn't retired, I probably would still be there. But it was an amazing thing. I think it was that realization more than anything that made me start to think seriously about, like, I wonder if I would ever do anything else about photography that wasn't about museums or MoMA. And so now the photo book club, we even thought about starting a book club when I was at MoMA for the Seeing Through Photographs audience, because they were such an engaged and enthusiastic and critical and curious group of people. And somehow we felt like we knew one another intimately. Like, I don't know how it's possible to imagine knowing hundreds of thousands of people, but you really do. And I think they felt the same way about me. So, like, every once in a while, I'll find myself in a diner and my waitress will be like, "Oh, are you Sarah Meister?" I'm like, "I am." And they took the course and they recognize me, they know me. Um, and I think the photo book club at Aperture is about taking that spirit of generosity, of like, wow, how lucky am I to know all of these brilliant artists, to be privy to conversations about how these books are made, and is there a way of sharing that with a broader group of people? And that was really the origins of the photo book club. And I'll say, I mentioned the strategic plan for Aperture at the end, because a lot of it is, we're moving to a new home. Aperture for the last 20 years has been in rented space, beautiful rented space on the fourth floor of a side street in Chelsea in Manhattan, which is really great space. But the people who find us there know that they're looking for us. It's like you wouldn't walk on that block unless you were, well, you're going to one of the galleries and Aperture among them. So Aperture's new home, where we'll be moving later this year, I hope. Um,
I believe it.
Okay.
If you build it, they will come.
We're working on it. Is two street level, or street level and a lower level, on in a residential neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at 78th Street in Columbus. And the idea is, can the conversation that we're having there honor what our founders were saying in 1952? Can we invite creative people everywhere into that space and into that conversation. And obviously, virtual is important too, because we don't want to be exclusively local. We'd love for you all to visit virtually, if not in person. But it is a street front presence in a residential neighborhood that's across the street from the new entrance to the Natural History Museum that has 5 million visitors annually. This is the beginning of a potentially of a conversation that really honors those roots, and that to me is the most interesting conversation that we could possibly have.
Mm-hmm. It's a real welcome to everyone, hopefully. Yeah. Sarah, I want to talk to you about your selection for the opening slide to your talk.
So does Ronan.
It's riveting. So tell us a little bit.
So this was a photograph made as an advertisement. And Ronan asked me, it does make you wonder, an advertisement for what? And I think that's precisely, that's one of the many things that I love about this photograph. An advertisement for what? It's an advertisement for Eastman Kodak. So this, if you look, the young man on the right is holding a camera, and his friends, who look to be selling soda pop, they are actually selling a sort of aspirational sense of leisure and how much fun it is to capture one's day-to-day post-ice skating experience, such as it might be, in front of a refrigerator in 1947. And to me, this photograph is every bit as technically proficient as those whose makers are trained as artists or amateurs, or and I think it's just, the print itself is very beautiful, but it was one of those ones for a long time at MoMA. I looked at it and I was like, what's that doing here? And then all of a sudden I decided that it was one of my favorite pictures in the collection.
It's amazing, and it's perfect for Minneapolis too. I love the skates and the toque,
and then
everything.
you look also the one who's leaning over the door. He's like standing on a pile of
newspapers.
I mean, it's just, it gets better and better the more you look at it.
I want to make sure that we're keeping some time for questions from the audience. Are there any out there?
Don't be shy. Okay.
Yes, I have a question. My question has to do with the beginning of photography, which started out, in my understanding, as an enthusiast, which would be another word for amateur. At what point, when did people start selling photographs and becoming professional photographers and sort of peeling off, or was that a critical response rather than an actual thing?
Okay, wow, that's such a great question.
Sure.
And of course, it's even more complicated than either one of the possible scenarios that you've outlined, which is part of what makes photography such a wonderful way to grapple with complexity in the world. Like, it just doesn't fit neatly into anything that you want. I would argue, and Casey could disagree with me, that photography was invented, according to legend, photography was invented nearly simultaneously in 1839 in France and in England. And there were two very different processes that, anyway, we'll skip all of the technological jargon. We'll jump ahead to, I would argue that for many decades, photography was technically, chemically very complex. And for as long as it was that complex and that hard to do, it was a reasonably narrow group of people who were making it for a very wide audience of people who wanted to be pictured, in a sense that if you couldn't commission an oil painting, you could go to a local studio and get someone to make a daguerreotype of you. Now, what was super interesting is that Kodak in the 1880s made a number of technological innovations that suddenly made photography easier. And so once photography was easier, the advertising campaign for those little circular pictures that I shared was you push the button, we do the rest. And in some ways, this slide is another expression of that. It's saying anyone can be a photographer. And there are different definitions of amateur. So there are amateurs who use it, to take pictures of your children, to record your own, like Blanche Parker, the telephone operator. That's one form of amateur. There's another form of amateur that's also, a very serious amateur. All those Brazilian modernist photographers, they were doctors and bankers and lawyers and teachers and engineers. They had day jobs, but they were committed amateurs in the sense that they gathered to learn how to make technologically sophisticated and visually compelling photographs. There are others as well. We'll leave those aside. But the interest, and actually part of the problem is that all of these terms overlap. So it's like you use the word amateur and you could mean truly for different things. But what was interesting, that was the beginning in the late 1880s with the you push the button, we do the rest. That was the moment when those people who had been very dedicated to thinking about the artistic qualities of photography felt more threatened than ever. So this was when Edward Steichen made a photograph like Moonrise Mamaroneck. Alfred Stieglitz was one of the more famous, Gertrude Casimir. They were making photographs, and the whole photo secession moment with pictorialism in general is to say, all of that isn't, that's not art. That's just the mass, the undifferentiated mass of photography. And it's those value judgments that pick up again with the vernacular and fine art divide that I think are partly what are so damaging. So it's almost like, to answer your question and to really think about this, you have to sit back and say, how can I understand the question fully enough to be able to offer something that points to how complicated the answer might be? And they're just, I wish, so I'm not even positive this has answered your question, but
we're still having this
yes,
conversation with our devices.
Yeah.
And
how can you be a photographer? Could anybody be a photographer? And actually, this is where I really wish Alec were here, because there are even some people who are unquestionably artists, but for whom an element of their practice is what differentiates what I do from what Sarah Meister does with a camera. And on some level, it's light years, and on some level, it's the closest cousin. And that discomfort with how close it can be, I think, is really, really interesting.
I have one thing.
Yeah. I think they want, because so they'll record you for posterity. Don't curse.
Thank you very much. I'm disturbed. First of all, I have Alzheimer's now,
Okay.
so I'll be trying to talk to you here.
Great.
But what's going now with everything on TV, and how they're throwing things over every day and throwing it over, and it is making it, and it's disturbing, very, very, for
Are
me.
you talking about visual?
A visual,
Yeah,
and
I
all
think
of
the
a
ocean
sudden,
of images, let's say.
they're throwing thousands of things in a day,
Mhm.
and it's, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question too, and interestingly, that's another version from a very different angle, that multiplicity of photography, how easy it is now to make these pictures and to circulate them through television, through your phone, through it's like, and to me, that's where the value of curators or organizations like Aperture, they're I think at their best, they're a filter to help say, isn't this interesting? How about we pay attention to this? Because the stream really is overwhelming. And, digital technologies are just another step in the technologies that started with flexible film and the Kodak #1 camera, where all of a sudden the number of photographs that were made in the world jumped, from this to this. And, with each technological development, I mean, who knows what's coming next, but there's something.
And I want to remind everyone here that we have a photography study room, and all of the 14,000 objects in our amazing photography collection are yours to visit and see. Many of the images you saw today, though certainly not all of them, have their counterparts in Mia's collection. Interestingly, I don't know if I reminded you of this, but I'm sure you know that we were the second venue after MoMA for Family of Man in
I
1955.
perhaps once knew that,
Yeah.
but I had definitely forgotten.
Yeah, it was from June to September.
Fabulous.
So we are unusually fortunate here to have a collection that has deep roots in some of the most thoughtful curators and thinkers around the field. And it's accessible to you. And certainly one of the strengths of the collection is understanding the history of photography, but also some of the pictorialist photography that is around that era of anxiety that we were talking about earlier. We have lots of it. So come see.
That's great. We used to joke at MoMA that you could pay $25 to go see the works in the galleries behind plexiglass, or you could make an appointment to go to the study center and hold it in your hands for free. So now I know Mia's free, which is great, by the way, really amazing. But I think that's, and as great as the works look on view in a generous outlook, and it's nice to see the way things are paired and sequenced. And, obviously there's a great value in going into the galleries, but nothing beats seeing them up close.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more quick question. Paula,
Thank you so much for being here. Could you speak a little bit more about the democracy of photography going forward and how all can hopefully support it as a democratic medium? As a photographer, I find it increasingly difficult to afford the medium. Once it's gone into the fine art, everything in fine art comes with it a very large price tag. And then for me, that's becoming quite challenging to go forward. And I think we may be limiting the world of art and growth and who gets access to it and who gets to speak and who gets to participate. And so I'm concerned about that future.
Well, I think that's another great question, because it speaks a little bit to what Gordon Parks was facing. Here he made a picture. He was working for a magazine in order to afford the color film to make that picture, and then he couldn't print it in color. So I think which is a version of exactly what you're describing. What I think, where I see hope in this is that, and Leslie, when you look around the world and you see, in fact, the myriad ways in which photographs are enjoyed and circulated, I see a lot of great work that's pinned to a wall, that's printed as a risograph, or in a less precious, smaller scale. And I remember there was a wonderful Robert Frank show that was, according to his foundation, his favorite show of his life, where they just printed his images on newsprint, and you kind of went around and you encountered them that way. And Alex Soth, I think, also is somebody who really is thinking about, the marriage of the idea and the execution need to work together. So if your idea is like Steichen's Moonrise Mamaroneck, then you're going to have to labor for weeks in a dark room to make the one precious thing that is the realization of that ambition. But if you're Dorothea Lange and you think, actually, what I really want to make is a compelling image that people want to look at, but I don't care how it circulates. I don't care if it's an 8x10 print or over the news wire or in a magazine or in a newspaper. And that marriage of the way it's shared and the way it's constructed matches that ambition for it, you can go in either path. And so there are lots of different ways in which I love seeing photographs these days. And, the biggest and most expensive print that's framed with Optium glass and all this, that's one way. And, I've seen work that I really like that's like that. But I would say to the democracy of the medium, there are 100 other ways in which I have encountered photographs in books. In particular, this is a new. I'm still learning about. I'm familiar with some photo books from history. However, joining Aperture has really heightened my attention to the joy of the photo book as a really democratic medium and artistic expression in its own right. And that's what the photo book club really is about. It's like, how can you share the joy of that? And a photo book doesn't have to be, printed on a print. You hand make a photo book. You make a zine. We did a book of Ari Markopoulos's work, and there are all of these wonderful ways in which the technology can be your friend when what you want to do has embedded in it what that end might look like.
And Paula, I think just as a quick coda to that, and to, I think, speak to some of the things that Sarah and I share as values as curators, former and present, and now a publisher. It's a very important responsibility that we have to continue to identify makers who are extraordinarily talented, who may not be someone everyone knows about, and to platform and celebrate that work with the resources we have access to. So in Sarah's case, that could mean hosting the photo book club, or working with them on a publication of their own. In my case, it's identifying them for an exhibition, or any number of other opportunities. So they kind of go hand in hand. But I think one central thing that I really am always heartened by in this field is that no matter how much it is drawn into other areas of the art market, especially the contemporary realm, there's always, as Sarah said, this counterweight with numerous passionate experimental individuals in other areas that keep it really lively and special. We've talked a lot about Alec, and I just want to also say you just did a recent terrific project with Paher. Who is traveling, so could not be here. But definitely look into that.
Yeah, and that photo book, it's a very modestly scaled. She had so many great ideas for. There are 32 different covers of that book, and the vinyl that they're cut from is an AI. It's our first AI generated cover, because we took some of the backdrops from her photographs and used AI to scale it to anyway. She's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's what we'll have time for. But Sarah, I want to thank you again for a terrific talk.
No, thank you.
And thank you all for coming today.